Hello, hi historians, and welcome to your next issue, which is issue 3, an evaluation of the reasons for the Cuban Crisis of 1962. Now, this PowerPoint is going to go through all of the factors that you need to know about and tasks for each of the factors that you need to know about for this issue of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, I'm not expecting you to do all of this in one sitting. I would recommend that you look at one factor at a time, and once you've looked at one of the factors, you can then stop and look at the following factor the next day. There's 5 factors in total, so for example on Monday, if you looked at factor 1, then Tuesday factor 2, Wednesday factor 3, Thursday factor 4, and then Friday factor 5 if you want to do it like that, but I'm not expecting you to do this all in one sitting. Now, the factors that we're going to look at in this issue, so you're looking at why does the Cuban Missile Crisis happen? So we're going to look at Fidel Castro's victory in Cuba as a reason why the Cuban Missile Crisis happens. We'll look at US foreign policy. We'll be looking at Khrushchev, Nikita Khrushchev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union at this time, his domestic position, why that leads to the crisis, Khrushchev's view of Kennedy, and the arms race. Now, to start with, we're going to do a wee introduction to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, you don't need to know exactly what happened in the crisis itself, it's the reasons why the crisis happened. However, this introduction to the crisis is going to give you some background on what actually happened. I'm going to do a wee task on that just so you understand what actually took place. So 13 days in October, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, the pictures you see here, on the left hand side you have Nikita Khrushchev, who's the leader of the Soviet Union. In the middle is Fidel Castro, who's the leader of Cuba. On the right hand side you have John F. Kennedy, who's the leader of America. Now, these are the 3 key men that are involved in this Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, what we're learning today we're going to look closely at the Cuban Missile Crisis. So by the end of this part of the lesson, what we're looking to do is to create a timeline detailing the events of what actually took place in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the crisis point of the Cold War. It was a time when both sides and the world came nearest to an all-out nuclear war, which would have potentially spelled the end of the world. And as mentioned, that is the 3 main men there that are involved. So Nikita Khrushchev, Fidel Castro, and John F. Kennedy. Now, if we look at this map here of America, you'll see there's an arrow pointing to Cuba, and it says any observations. Well, if you look closely at the map, hopefully you'll see there how close Cuba actually is to America. It's very, very close, and that's going to be important to when we look at this crisis. That is Cuba there. It is a smaller island, obviously, compared to America as a whole, but very, very close to America. Now, what has happened so far, just some background before the Cuban Missile Crisis actually started. Now, let's set the scene to see what has happened. So, in 1960, the U-2 crisis of 1960. A summit was planned for May 1960 to discuss Berlin, so the situation in Berlin. So if you remember back to issue 1, we looked at, obviously, Germany itself is divided into East and West Germany, and Berlin itself has been divided into East and West, effectively, with the Berlin Wall being built. So a summit was planned for May 1960 to discuss Berlin and nuclear weapons. Now, the American president at this time, President Eisenhower, wanted an open skies agreement, and that would mean that Russia and America would let spy planes fly over each other's countries, so that ultimately they could be assured that the other wasn't preparing for war. Khrushchev refused this, but in the end, Eisenhower decided to do it anyway. Now, that picture there you see on the left hand side, you have Eisenhower, the American president. On the right hand side, you have Khrushchev. Now, this is important to what happens. He was ultimately, sorry, I'll go back there. He was ultimately flying the U-2 spy plane. It was shot down and he was captured by the Russians. The wreckage of his spy plane is on display there in the Central Army Museum in Moscow. So this is a major, major issue in the Cold War. The fact that the US have been caught spying on the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union now have an American pilot as a prisoner. The results of this. Khrushchev was completely and utterly raging at the fact that ultimately Eisenhower had betrayed him. Now, Khrushchev refused to take part in the talks unless the Americans apologised and cancelled all future spy flights. Eisenhower did agree to cancel spy flights but would not apologise for what he had done. Now, this then led to a chain of events. Eisenhower's planned visit to Russia was then cancelled, and Khrushchev and the Russians grew in confidence whilst the Americans became angry with Eisenhower, who they said was ultimately losing the Cold War. And after the U-2 incident, it was now down to America to become a bit more aggressive, because it appeared that Khrushchev and the Russians now had the upper hand in the Cold War. Another major issue here is the Berlin Wall. which has just been built now. Many are angry as they felt that the Americans and the Allies, including Britain, had put up little attempt to halt the creation of the Berlin Wall. They simply let the Soviet Union do it. So that had caused a lot of tension as well and put pressure on the Americans to take a more aggressive stance. Then Eisenhower is no longer president. We have a new young president, John F. Kennedy. Now, Kennedy was elected because he promised to get tough with the communists, and he felt that Khrushchev had got one over on him at the Vienna summit, which we'll discuss in more detail in 1961, so he was going to get a bit more tougher with the Soviets. And that is the two there, John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev. Now, Nikita Khrushchev had said to Kennedy, force will be met by force. If the US wants war, that's its problem. It's up to the US to decide whether there will be war or peace. The decision to sign a peace treaty is firm and irrevocable, and the Soviet Union will sign it in December if the US refuses an interim agreement. Then, Kennedy says, Mr. Chairman, there will be a war, it will be a cold winter. So Kennedy wants to take a more aggressive stance towards the Soviets. Now, the two leaders were becoming increasingly frustrated at the lack of the progress of the negotiations that both sides were making, and ultimately this was going to lead to more tension. Now, what is the Cuban Missile Crisis itself? What actually happens? Now, what we're looking to do here is just describe the stages of the Cuban Crisis using some key dates and facts. So, the Soviet missiles on Cuba. What you're looking to do is to create either a timeline in your jotter, you could do a poster, you could do a mind map titled 13 Days in October. Now, there's going to be 13 entries to complete. You're looking to make sure you leave enough space to complete these 13 entries, and this is just to let you see what took place during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, you can add in colour, you can add in pictures if you want as well. Day 1, we have Tuesday, October 16th. President Kennedy is told that the Cubans have ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. Day 2, Wednesday, October 17th, President Kennedy discusses what he should do about the ICBMs in Cuba. So ultimately, the Cuban Missile Crisis is all about the Soviet Union placing missiles on Cuba, which were capable of obviously hitting America. Now, you have here the first 8 days of what took place in the crisis. Now, what we're asking you to do here, either your mind map, your timeline, your poster, you don't need to copy down word for word what's on each day. This is just to give you a background on what took place during the Cuban Missile Crisis. You can summarise this. So that is the first 8 days there. And then here is the next days up to day 13 when the crisis finally ends. So again, it's totally up to you how you want to lay this out in your jotter, what you want to do. I recommend that you pause the video at this point to do this in your jotter, and this is just letting you see what took place in the Cuban Missile Crisis itself, what actually happened. Now, this is just some pictures that the Americans were able to get of the missiles in Cuba. So you see here it's been labelled with what each part of the picture is showing, but ultimately this is the images of missiles being placed in Cuba by the Soviets. You're also able to gather images like this with the Soviets actually transporting missiles by ship towards the Soviet Union. And in total, the Russians sent 42 medium-range missiles and 24 intermediate-range missiles to Cuba. These had the capability of travelling around 3,500 miles, and 22,000 Russian troops and technicians also accompanied the missiles to Cuba. So this is some of the missiles that were placed on Cuba during the crisis. Now, our aim, what we're looking to do in this issue, is to find out why the Cuban Missile Crisis actually happened. So what you've just done there, the task you've done there, has given you some background detail about the crisis itself and what was happening before it. The main task and what you write your essay on in this issue is why the crisis actually happens. So, we're going to look at the first factor, which is Castro's victory in Cuba. Now, what we're going to do today is firstly we're looking to investigate why Castro's victory in Cuba contributed to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So by the end of this part of the lesson, you should be able to explain why Castro's victory contributed to the crisis and write a paragraph on Castro's victory for your essay. Now, Castro's victory in Cuba. Fulgencio Batista was leader of Cuba up until 1959, and that is him there. The Americans had actually helped him to establish himself in power in 1934. Now, his government was very, very corrupt and repressive, and many Cubans saw him as a symbol of the American control of Cuba. He loved being wealthy and powerful, but he was not very well liked. He is also backed by the Americans, so although he is capitalist, he is very, very corrupt, he's very repressive, and a lot of Cubans do not like him. Now, America owned and controlled the sugar trade in Cuba under Batista's rule at this time. Now, sugar was the main export of Cuba, and it's a vital commodity to the Cuban economy even today. Now, Batista's government were very, very friendly with the USA. It was the USA that was supporting Batista and his government in Cuba. The Cubans and Americans had always had a close alliance ever since the Americans had helped the Cubans win independence from Spain back in 1898, so their alliance went back a long time. However, a lot of the people in Cuba lived in poverty. There's a lot of low standards of living in Cuba and poor education and health services, while the minority of people in Cuba, the rich, benefited. Cuba was also seen to be almost a playground for some rich Americans because it was very, very close by. In America, a lot of Americans would go to Cuba to enjoy a nice holiday, for example, but there was a lot of poverty in Cuba as well. Now, Fidel Castro came to power in Cuba, which is very, very close, as we discussed. It's only 90 miles off the coast of Florida in 1959 to 1960. He actually overthrew the corrupt Batista regime in a left-wing revolution. Now, tensions arose when Fidel Castro decided to nationalise American companies in Cuba without compensation to the US. So he took over American companies under the Cuban government's control, under his control, but never gave any compensation to the Americans. Now, in retaliation to this, the Americans stopped all aid to Cuba and all imports of Cuban sugar. So they put a trade embargo on Cuba ultimately. Now, this was a big, big blow to Castro, as sugar was the mainstay of the Cuban economy, so that could cripple the Cuban economy if they didn't have anyone to buy their sugar. Now, this was very, very threatening to the US because Cuba as well was now a communist state. Although Fidel Castro, which we'll find out about, was not communist when he first came to power, eventually he becomes disillusioned with the Americans and turns into a communist. He is more left-wing to start with, but he's not a complete communist. But it was worrying to the Americans that Cuba had fallen like this due to how close it was to America. Now, Khrushchev himself saw this as an opportunity, and he was very, very sympathetic to Castro. And the reason for this, some historians have argued that he wanted to use Cuba as a launch pad for a revolution in Central America. So he wanted to show that Cuba turned communist and other countries around Central America and South America could also turn communist. The missile deployment, by using Cuba, missile deployment here would provide protection for the revolution. So it would mean that the Americans couldn't go and invade Cuba ultimately and take it over, that Cuba was now protected by the Russians. Now, after the US refused to actually trade with Cuba, Castro was forced to look to the USSR for help. Now, in 1960, the USSR actually signed an agreement to buy 1 million tonnes of Cuban sugar every year in return for oil, machines and money. Now, Castro had not been a communist when he first took power, although he was very, very left-wing. He had not been a communist when he took power. He became a communist after this agreement with the USSR. And that is a picture of Fidel Castro there at the bottom. Now, a good part for you to watch here, just to let you see what actually took place in Cuba and give you some background to this, is the CNN documentary. Now, I've put the link here, and I'll also post a link on the instructions via Teams. If you watch from 1 minute 50 up to 8 minutes, so roughly 6 minutes worth, then this will give you a good background in terms of what took place here in Cuba. Now, limitation, when we're thinking about why Fidel Castro's rise to power in Cuba is not as important in the Cuban Missile Crisis happening. Although Castro's victory in Cuba was important, you could argue it's not the most important reason for the crisis, because Castro had good relations with the US, so he did receive a positive visit when he visited the US in 1959, and many historians have actually agreed that Castro would have wished to continue a good relationship with the USA, therefore showing that Castro's victory was maybe not as important for the crisis emerging. It was arguably the US that forced Castro against themselves with the trade embargo that they put in place. Now, over to you. What you're looking to do for this first factor here is to complete the worksheet tasks. Now, these are uploaded via Teams as well. So you have information on Castro's victory in Cuba, and you have tasks there to complete, which will help you, and those tasks include writing your first paragraph. Now, as I said, I'm not expecting you to do all this in one sitting, so once you've done this first task for the first factor of Castro's victory in Cuba, I would leave the video just now, and you could always come back to it tomorrow, but if you even just look at one factor just now, so that is Castro's victory in Cuba. Now, the next reason for the Cuban Missile Crisis happening is US foreign policy. Now, what we're looking at today next is we're going to look closely at the US foreign policy this time. So by the end of the lesson, you should be able to explain why US foreign policy contributed to the Cuban Missile Crisis and write a paragraph on US foreign policy for your essay. So firstly, what is foreign policy? Foreign policy is all about how countries conduct themselves in relations with other countries, ultimately. Now, some countries follow quite an aggressive foreign policy, even today. Other countries like to stay more neutral and just keep good relations in terms of their foreign policy. So foreign policy is all about how you interact with other countries and your actions towards other countries. Now, the US foreign policy at this time, the US had actually adopted quite an aggressive foreign policy, especially towards communism. And this may have pushed Cuba towards the USSR and allowed the USSR to place missiles on Cuba as a form of defence. Now, firstly, the USA still saw South America as its own backyard, so to say, due to its location. It still believed in something called the Monroe Doctrine, which was opposed to having any sort of foreign states having any sort of influence in the Americas. Ultimately, the USA saw South America as its own backyard. It owned South America, ultimately, in its own view. America was also very, very sensitive about the presence of a communist state so close to Florida. Now, the Bay of Pigs invasion of 1961, which we'll be looking at in more detail later on, this had been an attempt to overthrow Castro's government. This ultimately failed, which we will be looking at, but again, this shows that ultimately the USA was not happy about communism being so close to its country. And also, American aggression seemed to be confirmed by the US practicing the invasion of a Caribbean island named Operation Ortsac. So ultimately, the US is very, very aggressive at this stage, does not want any countries across the world, but especially close to USA, falling to communism. Now, the Bay of Pigs invasion, which as I said we'll look at in more detail later on, was an attempted invasion using Cuban exiles and American soldiers to try and take over Cuba. Now, these pictures here show you on the left hand side you've got the Cuban exiles, which was funded by America, being arrested after the invasion. You've got a map there which shows the Bay of Pigs where the invasion was launched, and you've got President Kennedy here. We'll discuss this in more detail later on, but this ultimately is an attempted invasion of Cuba by the Americans. However, it proves to be a complete failure, and it completely damages Kennedy's reputation. Another part of US foreign policy was putting missiles on Turkey. Now, if you think about a map, Turkey is very, very close to the Soviet Union. You see on the map here, Turkey part of NATO, and you have the Warsaw Pact countries there. Now, Turkey, very, very close to the Soviet Union, very, very close to the capital Moscow. You see here the Jupiter missile range, so potentially these missiles could hit major cities in Russia. Now, the United States had placed their Jupiter missiles in Turkey in 1961 because they feared the possible nuclear capabilities of the Soviet Union. Now, these missiles became a major threat to the Soviets because they were capable of striking anywhere within the USSR effectively. As a counter move, Khrushchev wanted to put missiles at America's back door because he felt, well, if America has missiles in Turkey which can threaten us, we need to protect ourselves and put missiles in Cuba. Now, the limitation to this, why maybe US foreign policy is not as important in causing the Cuban Missile Crisis. However, it can be argued that the aggressive reaction from the US was because they feared another surprise attack similar to Pearl Harbor in 1941, therefore showing that the main aim was not in starting a missile crisis with Cuba and the USSR, but solely as a form of protection. So the argument here is that ultimately, although the USA have put missiles in Turkey, they're not looking to cause a crisis here. They're not looking for the Cuban Missile Crisis to happen. They're doing this solely as a form of protection. Again, over to you here for US foreign policy. So you have a worksheet task to complete. Again, these worksheets are uploaded via Teams, so you'll be able to access them there. So this explains US foreign policy in a bit more detail, and you've got a task to complete, which again includes writing your paragraph on why US foreign policy caused the Cuban Missile Crisis to happen. Again, if you want to pause the video at this point, you can complete the worksheet task for that. Again, you can come back to the video at a later stage to look at the next factor. Okay, factor number 3 is Khrushchev's domestic position in terms of why this causes the Cuban Missile Crisis to happen. Now, what we're going to look at next is Khrushchev's domestic position. So we're going to look to explain why Khrushchev's domestic position contributed to the Cuban Missile Crisis and to write a paragraph on Khrushchev's domestic position for your essay. Now, Russia in the 1960s. Khrushchev is under a lot of pressure domestically in Russia in the 1960s. There has been a lot of economic cuts in Russia. There's been cuts to the army. There is a lot of people starving in Russia at this time. There's very, very difficult situation unfolding. So Khrushchev has that to contend with. He also has the Berlin Wall to contend with, where there's issues over people trying to leave East Berlin to get into West Berlin. And Khrushchev is also committed to something known as de-Stalinisation. Now, de-Stalinisation was effectively, Khrushchev gave a speech denouncing Joseph Stalin, his reign. So basically saying that Joseph Stalin was wrong for some of the things that he did and going against Stalin to an extent. So he's dealing with a lot of issues in Russia at this time. Now, Khrushchev's domestic position, he had to make a stand for Russia for several reasons. Now, two of the most important reasons he had to start making a stand for Russia and to improve his domestic position. Ultimately, he's getting criticised at home over cuts in the armed forces, over economic failures, and over issues surrounding de-Stalinisation. There's also revolutions in countries like Hungary that are looking to break away from the Soviet Union, and there's the ongoing stalemate over the Berlin Wall. Now, he believed that a foreign policy coup would actually help him improve matters at home. So if he could achieve something very, very good foreign policy wise, if he could get one over on the Americans, so to say, then this would help his domestic position. Also, another big problem that's emerging is the rise of China at this time as a rival for the leadership of the communist world. Now, there's increasing pressure on Khrushchev from influential circles within the USSR to assert Soviet leadership, to show that the Soviet Union is the leader of the communist world. Now again, he believes that having missiles in Cuba would highlight Russia's military strength and technological strength, not only to the Americans but also to the Chinese as well. So he's under pressure at home due to issues such as cuts at home, but also under pressure due to the rise of China and the fact that they are threatening the communist leadership. Now, thinking again limitation wise, why Khrushchev's domestic position is not as important to causing the Cuban Missile Crisis. We have here, however, some historians argue that Khrushchev's actions were focused on creating a crisis with Cuba and the USA. His actions were designed to gain concessions from the West over the situation in Germany and Berlin. If JFK had agreed to the West leaving Berlin, then the crisis may not have started in the first place. So arguably, maybe not as important to the crisis happening, because Khrushchev's not looking, again, some historians would argue, to create a crisis between themselves and America. He's going to create a short crisis between Cuba and the USA just to gain concessions in Germany and in Berlin. He's not looking to cause this massive crisis which it unfolds, some people would argue. Again, over to you here, you have another worksheet task to complete in terms of Khrushchev's domestic position. So again, this explains the position that Khrushchev is in at home, and you have tasks to complete, which also includes writing a paragraph on why Khrushchev's domestic position led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Again, this sheet is available via Teams. Again, once you've completed this, you could stop this video just now and come back to it later on another day and look at the next factor. Okay, factor number 4 is Khrushchev's view of Kennedy. Now, what we're going to look at next is Khrushchev's view of President Kennedy. So we're looking to explain why Khrushchev's view of Kennedy contributed to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and to write a paragraph on Khrushchev's view of Kennedy for your essay. Now, Khrushchev's view of Kennedy. Khrushchev felt that Kennedy was a weak president who lacked support and power due to the following reasons. Firstly, Khrushchev and John F. Kennedy had held face-to-face talks in June 1961 in Vienna. Now, at this summit in Vienna, Khrushchev believed Kennedy was very, very weak. The historian William Taubman has suggested that Khrushchev merely felt he could push JFK around, maybe due to the fact he was quite a bit younger than Khrushchev. Also, the fact that the US had not opposed any sort of construction of the Berlin Wall, that reinforced the view that JFK was quite a weak president in Khrushchev's view. Also, Khrushchev felt that Kennedy lacked power and support to make concessions over the arms race. Kennedy had won by just over 100,000 votes when he became president, so he lacked a reliable majority in Congress at home. He lacked support arguably at home, so Khrushchev felt he was in quite a perilous and weak position there as well. Now, Kennedy's domestic context, he also makes mistakes which arguably makes himself look even weaker. Now, US interest investments in Cuba had been lost in the revolution. Remember, Castro had nationalised a lot of American companies, and Cuban exiles in Florida were vocal in their demands for US action against Castro. So the result of these demands was the Bay of Pigs, which we've already mentioned, which took place in 1961. Now, on the 17th of April 1961, the CIA encouraged, funded and transported an attempt by 1,511 anti-Castro Cuban exiles to invade Cuba, and the sole intention of this invasion is to overthrow the Castro government. Now again, that is a map there where you could see the Bay of Pigs where the revolution was launched. Now, this attempted invasion proved a complete nightmare. It proved a fiasco. It failed miserably. It embarrassed President Kennedy. Jeeps landed without any fuel. There was no maps of the islands being issued. Cuban exiles were firing on each other. It was a complete disaster. Now, part of the reason for this, you had razor-sharp coral reefs which delayed landing, so this meant that more ships were exposed to air attacks. 2 ships actually sank 80 yards from the shore, which led to heavy equipment being lost. It was regarded as the biggest flaw that Kennedy halted US air support after the brigade landed, giving the Cubans control of the skies. And the Cubans already had some Soviet military support in the form of tanks, so the Cubans were well prepared for a possible invasion. Now, by numbers, in total, there was 1,511 American soldiers, or what you could describe as Cuban exiles. Now, the average age of these exiles was 23. Now, ultimately, it was 75,000 Cubans against these 1,511 Americans. Now, the Cubans outnumbered the Americans 50 to 1, and that image there shows you the one in red being the one American versus all of the Cubans. Now, 5 planes were actually shot down in the Bay of Pigs invasion, and 1 plane was actually lost. 2 boats sunk. 400 American soldiers, or exiles, you want to describe them like that, lost their lives. 1,100 were captured, and in total, to make sure that the exiles were then released, you can see there lots and lots of US dollars in terms of food and drugs were need to be given to the Cubans in exchange for those captured. Now, the results of the Bay of Pigs invasion. To Castro, this episode showed him where America stood in relation to Cuba. So it's argued that the Bay of Pigs invasion forced Castro to start preparing to defend himself a bit more against another attack, and grew him closer to Khrushchev and the Soviet Union. Now, in September 1961, Castro asked for, and Russia publicly promised, weapons to defend Cuba against the Americans. Now, in order to defend themselves from the missiles in Turkey and further invasions, and to help Cuba, the Soviets placed missiles in Cuba. And this gives you an image here in terms of where the missiles have been placed and the capabilities they had of hitting near enough every major city across the USA. Now, this leads to President Kennedy again needing to talk to Khrushchev, but Khrushchev has taken advantage of what he feels of Kennedy's weak position and the mistakes that Kennedy has made. And although both leaders speak to each other at Vienna as well, Khrushchev ultimately knows that he has the upper hand at this point on Kennedy, arguably. Now, the limitation why Khrushchev's view of Kennedy maybe isn't as important to causing the Cuban Missile Crisis. However, Khrushchev was aware of the dangers of nuclear war and realised that aggressive acts could result in disaster. The historian Stefan Karner has actually wrote that the two sides got a vision of hell in Vienna. They saw the apocalypse of a nuclear war, highlighting that both sides were fearful of pushing on with the arms race, so therefore it wasn't a key factor in why the crisis started. So ultimately, although Khrushchev viewed Kennedy as weak and thought he could push him around, he did also realise that nuclear war is not an option, because nuclear war could lead to the end of the world and the end of humanity. So although he realises that he can maybe bully Kennedy to an extent, he also realises that he can't push Kennedy too far, because neither side is able to use nuclear weapons against each other, because it would mean the end of the world. So arguably, this is not as important a factor, because yes, although he views him as weak and he can't push him around, he also realises that he can't push Kennedy too far, because there's only so far he can go. Now again, over to you. What you're looking to do here is to complete the worksheet task. This again highlights Khrushchev's view of Kennedy, what Khrushchev thought of Kennedy, and you have tasks to complete there, including writing the paragraph. So again, if you want to stop the video at this point and complete that worksheet, and you can come back to the video at a later stage to look at the next factor. Okay, the last factor that we're looking at is the arms race. Okay, so what we're going to look at next is the arms race. So by the end of the lesson, what you're looking to do is to explain why the arms race contributed to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and to write a paragraph on the arms race for your essay. So a quick recap, what was the arms race? If you remember here, this image is showing you quite well. The arms race is all about both Soviet Union and America competing against each other to have the best nuclear capabilities. That includes not only soldiers and tanks, for example, but mainly bombs as well. So the arms race is all about competing against each other in terms of weapons. Now, increased tension between the two countries at such a fast rate meant that they were almost neck and neck in the battle for nuclear dominance. Now, John F. Kennedy actually placed Jupiter missiles, as we know, in Turkey in 1961 because he feared a possible nuclear attack from the USSR, and they had the ability to effectively reach anywhere in the USSR. By 1962, the USSR had also fallen well behind the USA in the nuclear arms race. So by 1962, the US had around 4,000 missile warheads at its disposal, compared to around 220 for the USSR. Now, if we think about both points here, which we've already discussed as well. Firstly, JFK placing missiles in Turkey. That puts pressure on Khrushchev. He feels that the USSR cannot be threatened like this, so arguably putting the missiles in Cuba is a way of protecting themselves. Also, the fact that the USSR has fallen behind the USA in terms of nuclear capability by 1962, putting missiles in Cuba again arguably shows that the USSR is able to compete with the USA, and ultimately it's not that far behind them. This image here just shows you in terms of both sides what the nuclear capabilities was like. The graph at the top is quite a good illustration. You've got through the years from 1945, 1950, 1960, 1970, 1980 and 1991. The red line representing the USSR and the blue line representing the USA. How both sides rank in terms of the amount of nuclear weapons that they have. Now you can see there that obviously when we're thinking about this Cuban Missile Crisis in the 1960s, the USA is a fair bit ahead of the USSR. So arguably putting pressure on the USSR to take some action. Now thinking about the limitation here, why the arms race may be not as important to the Cuban Missile Crisis happening. However, you could argue that US Jupiter missiles were obsolete, so they only had a short range and were vulnerable to attack from Soviet aircraft. So therefore, the USSR were not under pressure to place missiles on Cuba as a form of retaliation, is what some historians and people would argue. Again, over to you. You have a worksheet task to complete here, looking at the arms race itself, why that causes the Cuban Missile Crisis to happen. Okay, now once you've finished each of the factors, looking at all of them, there is the CNN Cold War documentaries to watch, the one on Cuba. This would be a good idea for you to watch this just to let you see what actually took place in Cuba. It gives you also the build up to the crisis itself and what actually happened. This would be a good way of summarising this issue for you. What you're looking to upload via Teams, again, you can either just take a picture of your jotter, or if you've done this on a Word document, you can upload this. It's entirely up to you. You're looking to upload your answers to the completed worksheet tasks, including the paragraphs for the 5 factors in this issue. So you've looked at Castro's victory in Cuba, US foreign policy, Khrushchev's domestic position, Khrushchev's view of Kennedy, and the arms race. Now, you're not looking to write the essay as a whole just now. Obviously, it's just completing the worksheet tasks for each of those 5 factors. Now again, if you have any questions at all about anything in this presentation for any of the factors, then please just get in touch with myself or Mrs. Forte. Thank you very much.